Hello. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about perhaps some of the underestimation that the West has taken of Russia's capability in the Russian special military operation or Ukraine war over the last year, and have a look at perhaps some of the myths that we see in the Western media that may not align with the reality on the battlefield or what's actually going on. I want to talk a little bit. One of the things that we've heard quite a lot from the West is that Russia is running out of missiles, and that Russia has no capability to keep up its missile production due to the fact that it's heavily dependent upon Western processors, computer chips, to allow the navigation of those missiles to happen. This is true. There's no denying that Russia does depend on Western chips, from Motorola and Intel and companies like that in their military equipment. But it's something that I just want to touch on and have a look at some of the details out there. So, yes, the Russians have obviously made attempts over the last few years to prepare themselves better. Since 2014, they've known that they've been looking towards some sort of conflict over Ukraine. We must remember that the Donbass and Donetsk and areas like that in eastern Ukraine have been under a separatist conflict where pro-Russian Ukrainians living in Ukraine, but Russian-speaking Ukrainians living in Ukraine, have been under attack from the Ukrainian military since 2014. A lot of people don't realise that those areas in the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east have been being shelled by Ukraine since 2014. So Russia's been involved in there, assisting the separatists in that region since that time. So I'd say it's a fair assumption that Russia has been preparing for a wider conflict, and that as part of that preparation, they may well have, begun to do larger orders, purchase larger orders before 2022, before the sanctions were in place to stop them from receiving Western chips. So, you make a few more extra orders and the chip manufacturers think, great, we're selling heaps to the Russians, no problems there. The Russians have put some of those aside, so they've got some for times when stocks may run low. The Russians have their own chip manufacturing companies. Now, it seems that they're not up to the same level of precision and technology, perhaps, as what we see out of Taiwan, who leads the world in that area. But still, they've got capability there, and no doubt they're heavily investing billions of dollars each year into that and growing that, particularly now after the conflict has started. But interestingly, if we have a look at just some of the what's being reported around Russian access to Western-made processors, if we have a look here, we can see that since the war started, or prior to the war, we can see that there was a fair amount being spent by Russia in Taiwan. These figures here are in Taiwan of purchasing chips, predominantly American-made, Western-made chips. If we look after the start of the war, we can see that number has more than doubled. So, with the sanctions in place, and specifically with sanctions targeting Russian chip manufacturers to stop them purchasing Western chips, and in general to stop Western chips flowing to Russia, we see that even with those in place, the numbers have increased since the start of the special military operation. If we look here just on a monthly basis, and just looking at exports of Intel, it's from the company of Intel, manufacturer of processors to Russia, we can see that, look, they're doing about $500 million of sales. About $500 million of sales in 6 or 7 months. So maybe getting close to $1 billion a year. Which is a lot, and I guess kind of makes you question whether the story that Russia will soon start to run out of missiles because they won't have the chips to support them, whether that is a valid claim, particularly if we start to consider that along with what's being reported now and has been reported for a number of weeks, almost daily strikes, missile strikes across Ukraine, involving a range of different types of missiles. So this is something if you're starting to follow the conflict, it's an interesting topic to have a think about, to see if you think that Russia is going to run out of missiles in the near future, or if perhaps, given the fact that through proxy countries, through the likes of China and India and companies established, which may be Russian companies but established in other areas of the world, they're able to still continue to buy large quantities and in fact growing quantities of these complex and required computer processing chips to power the navigational components of their missiles. If this is increasing, then perhaps the Russians will be able to continue to produce missiles for the conflict. What else we got here? Something else we hear a lot about is about Russian morale, their tactics, and the mobilization of their resources. So there's plenty of Western media commenting about how the Russian army is failing due to a lack of morale. Let's just have a look over here. And the fact that they may be struggling for reserves and resources. Well, right off the bat, we can see here that even Western media is reporting that the mobilization that started last September will see the Russians raise perhaps 500,000 new troops. That mobilization is occurring on the background of a country with 143 million people. So 500,000 people to be raised in a mobilization is not a great deal of the population, and quite logically, should Russia need to, they would be able to raise a lot more, particularly if they progress to the point of really pressing people into conscription. You would imagine that there would be a lot larger number than 500,000, which is being touted as being raised at this stage. Now also, this mobilisation, starting last September, has now had 6-7 months for those recruits to undergo basic training, to be put into some specialist training in some areas, and to be moved out, not to the front line perhaps, but to the rear areas behind the front lines now, and slowly introduce some of those troops to frontline activity to get them some experience, so that when either Ukraine starts its offensive, or if the Ukraine offensive continues to stall and instead the Russians decide it's time to initiate their offensive, these 500,000 new soldiers won't be completely green. They will have had some experience at the front line, and depending on how long the delays are, maybe up to 9 months of training time. So this leads into also a question around morale of the Russian and Ukrainians. Now both Russian and Ukrainian forces are fighting in what they believe to be an existential crisis for their country. Ukrainians, obviously, they've been invaded by Russia. They're fighting for their country, and they're losing grip of their country. Approximately 20% of the country is now under under Russian control. The Russians, however, are also fighting what they believe to be an existential threat to Russia. They've seen the training of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians take place by the US-led and British-led PMCs and NATO forces since 2014. Something that's not widely reported in the West, but there are articles out there confirming that the private military companies of the West have been in the Ukraine since 2014 in advisory roles and training roles, and training tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers in modern Western military tactics, getting them familiar with NATO equipment. So Russia has seen that happening. So both countries are in what they believe to be an existential crisis, fighting for their country. However, in terms of morale, if we look at what some of the differences might be, Ukraine is being attacked on its home ground. Like, Ukraine is actually watching the west of its country be taken over, and watching cities, large cities like Artyomsk, or what was formerly named by the Ukrainians as Bakhmut, and Mariupol, and other cities be completely devastated, just be reduced to rubble as the fighting progresses through those towns. The capital of Kyiv is undergoing nightly missile strikes now, and missile strikes that are allegedly or seemingly targeting the air defense capabilities of Kyiv, such that reports of more and more missiles getting through are happening as the air defense systems are being exhausted. So the Ukrainians have got that to think about. They're aware of the fact that the Russians have got at least 300 to 500,000 new recruits being trained. They're seeing on the ground losses of large numbers of their soldiers in areas like Bakhmut and other areas, but Bakhmut is one which has been publicised the most. So in terms of morale, while people, like recently I saw on Lex Fridman's podcast, Stephen Kotkin on there, Stephen, who's a Western specialist on Russia and particularly on Stalin, he was talking there about implying how the outlook is pretty good for the Ukrainians, and that all that Ukraine has to do is turn their position from defensive to an offensive one, and that he implied that Russia might fall apart due to the army disintegrating because of a lack of morale, and Russian soldiers being fed dog food and them not having enough weapons and rifles or even uniforms. Now, this is a prominent narrative in the West, but again, I don't know that it's backed up by fact. When we look at things like we've just discussed, missiles still being produced, a more than doubling of the number of chips for these missiles arriving in Russia. It does make me question whether the Russians are really at risk of becoming demoralized and suddenly throwing in the towel to say that they've had enough. I guess we'll see. Tactics. Tactics is another one where we've heard lots about in the past the old World War I human wave tactics, which has been well publicized in the West, that the Russians are just wasting their resources, like in World War I, just getting thousands of men and they're just running blindly towards the Ukrainians. Now, there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support this. There's in a war where we have daily videos flooding social media of mobile phone, GoPro video showing trench fighting, showing aerial and drone footage. What we don't see is any evidence of Ukrainian machine gunners gunning down waves of Russians advancing towards them. It's just not something that's appearing. We see instead the Russians advancing, developing more complex and professional tactics, doing things like using some of their younger, perhaps inexperienced troops not in frontline heavy battling roles, but instead sending them out in small groups to draw Ukrainian fire, to identify Ukrainian locations, and once the location has been revealed, to allow the Russians, at this stage, far outmatched, heavily superior volume of Russian artillery, to then pour shells into those locations. This tactic is something which the Ukrainians aren't able to enact at this stage as well, because they are underpowered in terms of artillery, compared to the Russians. But this tactic is one which is by no means a human wave attack. This is where you use a small number of your resources, you guard and husband those resources, but yes, put some of them into a perilous position where they are out on the front line, but not necessarily engaged in fierce fighting, but instead able to draw and reveal the location of your opponent. So we see modern tactics like that from the Russians. We also see what you would call, I suppose, more strategic operations, restrained and composed fighting tactics. If we consider the Battle of Bakhmut, where many people have considered this in the West to have been a failure of Russia. Difficult thing to see as a failure, given that Russia has claimed Bakhmut, but still often considered to be in the West to be a failure for Russia, claimed that it was a failure of their offensive and that they just lost tens of thousands of resources and it was a waste for them to try it. However, if you look at the battle reports that come out, if you have watched some of the maps which show the progress over the last few months, say from October of last year, what seems to have happened is that the Russians strategically decided to use Bakhmut, as they in the West have referred to it, as a meat grinder, a trap, if you will, where instead of just advancing from east to west across Bakhmut, what happened was they engaged in Bakhmut and then they spread wings or pincers around Bakhmut and effectively encircled the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut on three sides. And once that had happened, it was apparent that couldn't be denied that the Bakhmut was becoming encircled. The Western narrative then turned to one of claiming that the Russians couldn't complete the circle and couldn't capture and take Bakhmut. But the Russians had been stating for some time that that wasn't their intent. The intent was to draw in Ukrainian forces to Bakhmut, because Zelensky had been publicly stating that Bakhmut would not be lost, that Ukrainians would retain every inch of it, would not give up an inch. So with that declaration, the Russians seem to have taken that as an opportunity and said, well, we'll encircle the area, leave a gate open so that forces can get in and out, and then we'll just whittle them down. So that's what seems to have happened. And that, again, doesn't seem to have been a human wave attack. It seems to have been a strategic decision to not close the pincers for a period of time, for months, just to be able to demilitarize the Ukrainian army in that location. Also, Russia in this area has been able to leverage air support across the fronts, and now doing that more strategically, or more tactically at least, with their FAB 500s and FAB 1000s large bombs. There's reports of them dropping up to 20 of those a day now. 20 bombs doesn't sound like a large number, but these are now tactical guided glide bombs, which they can drop safely from their fighter bombers at some distance away from any Ukrainian air defense systems, and let these bombs then glide in, and with whatever control they've got upon them, allow them to target areas on the front line. And these are massive. These are 500 kilogram and 1 ton of explosives in these bombs. So again, there's a collection of tactics and operations from the Russians which doesn't seem to align with this Western idea of human wave attacks. One last thing that we just want to talk about while we're in this space is, if we go, I must suggest to any of you who are interested in the Ukraine war and what's happening, to go to YouTube and look up History Legends. Alexander from History Legends is great. His channels, his shows are interesting and fun, and very informative. One of his recent ones here has just given great insight as to more of the Russian advanced or modern techniques of warfighting, where he demonstrates how given that the Russians have now had time to prepare defences, they've made this defensive approach become one which is of layered defences. So there's not just a single front line upon which the Russians will defend the upcoming Ukrainian offensive. Instead, in some areas, there are 5 or 6 layers of defence. And again, as Simplicius the Thinker has written on his Substack, what the Russians are using here in some of these zones is what he refers to as crumple zones. And so the crumple zones are an area of land which may not be of great strategic value, may be flat land, may be difficult to defend. What the Russians are doing there is then using that land, placing a small number of their soldiers out into that area, letting them dig into some trenches, and letting them operate in a mode of not defending that area, but simply in slowing the area, and again alerting if the Ukrainians begin to advance through that area. So once the Ukrainians begin to advance, they put down some fire to try and slow them down, and then they can retreat with ideally low or no losses, but it alerts the artillery behind to where the advance is coming from. And then if the Ukrainians make it through that first layer, they then start to encounter the more reinforced second and third layer. Then after the third layer, there's another crumple zone if they get through there. And then there are a number of maps coming out of areas of where the Russian defensive line is growing. And you can see this very clearly drawn out. Areas where there are angled defensive areas which would look to guide attacking forces into zones which would be beneficial to the Russians then, where they're able to then set up crossfire attacks on those areas. So yeah, I would say have a good look at history legends. Another topic which comes up often, and which we might want to just speak a little bit, is a little bit about Russian air power and the fact that Russian air power is diminishing. Look, it's estimated at the moment that only about 5% of the Russian Air Force is active at any one time in the conflict with Ukraine. So with what is going on, with the missile strikes degrading Russian Air Force, degrading Ukrainian air defense systems, with the video out from about a week ago of a Patriot missile system in Kiev being destroyed or at least damaged, with US confirmation of that damage happening, the ability of the Russian Air Force to become more engaged in this conflict seems to be growing. We do have here reports just this week of the Russian Air Force getting a new batch of their Su-34 fighter bombers. Now, while the numbers aren't mentioned, the fact that these fighter bombers are being produced after a year of sanctions does indicate that the Russian Air Force is capable of not only sustaining itself but continuing to produce. And if we look towards some of the news that's come out just recently, as really well covered by Alexander Mercouris from the Duran, that Odessa has just seen air-launched missile strikes, and that the last Ukrainian warship in the Black Sea has apparently been sunk this week. Odessa being Ukraine's only access really to the Black Sea now, with that being of vital importance to Ukraine, because it being a port to which it can access the Black Sea to let its grain shipments out. With the degrading of air defense across Ukraine, it appears now that perhaps Odessa is having to relinquish some of its air defense systems as they're being moved back to Kiev to protect Kiev from missile and air launch strikes. So yeah, in terms of tactics, in terms of Russian air power dismissing in both these areas, there seems to be a lot of evidence to the contrary, which might indicate that perhaps Russia isn't suffering in these areas. Another topic I want to talk about is the one of there being no Nazis in Ukraine. Oh, sorry, just before I get to that, I do need to mention John Mearsheimer. Again, if you're interested in these sort of topics of the Ukraine war, of what's going on, geopolitics, that sort of thing, John Mearsheimer is someone who you must check out. John is an international relations realist. He is very well researched. He's been in the role he's been in for 45 years now, and he's one of the few people who, prior to this Ukrainian war, and in fact prior to 2014, and in fact prior to 2008, has been publicly stating that a conflict in Ukraine would come if the West and NATO continued to arm the Ukraine, continued to push for the Ukraine to join NATO. And by all accounts, he has been shown to be correct in this area. So do go and check out some John Mearsheimer. Okay. No Nazis in Ukraine. Look, this just isn't true. The Azov battalion are actual far-right neo-Nazis operating in Ukraine. The recent attacks in the Belgorod region, so we have Belgorod just up here in Russia. This has involved a group of what Ukraine are calling anti-Russian partisans. However, what they are is Ukraine-backed fighters operating with Ukraine, calling them anti-Russian separatists, to try to distance the fact that these guys are wearing Ukraine uniforms, are being supplied with US military equipment, US weapons, and the Ukraine are doing this because this contradicts their promises to the West that any material weaponry supplied to them would only be used in the Ukraine and wouldn't be used to assist or to fight in areas outside of the Ukraine. So the Azov Group, which are well known and one of the more advanced and like famous, if you will, of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Azov Group have got clear neo-Nazi ties and ideas and ideologies running throughout them. If you search for the Azov Battalion, you'll find that this is their patch or their badge, which has the Nazis' wolf angel motif and the black sun design, and that recently, where are we? Recently, they have made a move to rebrand themselves because they made a move to rebrand and move away and use a different logo because of the clear Nazi ties to the ones that they have been using in the past. Now, in the area of Belgorod, and who is fighting in there? So the groups that are fighting in there, even the Ukrainians are claiming that they are neo-Nazis. Now, as I say, be aware, these are not Russians fighting Russians. These are Ukraine forces effectively fighting Russians under the guise of being Russian separatists. But even as the Ukrainians say here, or as the Western media says, they are neo-Nazis fighting in the Belgorod region. And the group who are fighting there, some of them, this group here, what's this guy's name? This is Denis Kapustin, also named by his alias of White Rex. If you look closely on his hat there, it's got Rex written on there. You can research White Rex online. And if you do go and research it, you'll find that it's a far right term. has some unpleasant meanings behind it, which I won't go into here, but you can research it. And interestingly, there's even a far-right clothing label called White Rex, which produces neo-Nazi and far-right clothing. So these are some of the people involved in the attacks led from Ukraine at the moment, where they are now shelling into Belgorod, which is a town inside Russia. So, yeah, I think it leads again to us to just question the idea that there are no Nazis in Ukraine. Okay, the last one that I want to talk about then is just the overall Russian goals and the idea that Vladimir Putin is determined to capture the Ukraine and to build the Russian Empire. So this is much talked about as to the reasons of why this offensive has started by the Russians and why they're fighting in Ukraine. But again, as I mentioned, I'm going to draw a little bit from some of John Mearsheimer's work here. But there is no evidence of this. There's no evidence of Putin stating that he wants to go and build the Russian Empire and take what was the USSR and join all of those countries back together into the great Russian Empire. There's no public evidence of him stating that he wants to claim the Ukraine. There is evidence of him stating that Russia accepts and understands there is Ukrainian nationality, and that prior to the special military operation, Putin stating that they fully understood that Ukraine's future was in Ukrainian hands. There was no mention or discussion of the fact that Russia wished to claim and take Ukraine. There are many problems with this if they were to try to do that. The biggest of them is as Mearsheimer calls it, the porcupine problem. The west of Ukraine is anti-Russian. The east of Ukraine is pro-Russian. So Russia doesn't want to swallow up the Ukraine. If they swallow up the Ukraine, they've then got to deal with the problem of swallowing up states and oblasts full of Ukrainians who hate them. It's a problem that they just don't want, and they've never announced that they wish to do that. What is far more likely, and I believe that this is a goal that has evolved for the Russians as the military operation has proceeded and was not their original intention. And we can go in and talk about that later in another episode. But I think what might happen now is that the Russians will continue westward across Ukraine till they reach the Dnieper River, and then hold at that line, swoop down, take Odessa, allow Transnistria to be joined up, and effectively cut off the Ukraine from having access to the Black Sea. That makes sense as to something that they would do. And then, having moved across to the Dnieper and got half effectively of Kiev taken back under Russian control, they would then look for a regime change. Definitely. They would want a government in Ukraine that will agree to being neutral, that they would agree to not joining NATO, not being Western aligned, and instead being neutral. If that were to happen, then I think the Russians would say, yep, that's enough. We've got what we want. Our stated objectives of demilitarizing Ukraine, denazifying Ukraine, and having Ukraine be neutral, which are things that the Russians announced to the UN and to the states in January or December of 2021, prior to the conflict starting, but it was rejected out of hand by the US. I think they would still accept those terms. The challenge, of course, is that would the West, would the US accept a neutral Ukraine and a government in Ukraine that was neutral and was not aligned with the West? I mean, I don't think it's something that they would want to, not given how invested they are now. So who knows? That seems to be a way out. That would be something that the Russians would accept. If the West could accept, that could be a way out of the conflict. If it's not something the West could accept, then maybe we're looking at NATO, a full-scale NATO intervention. And who knows, let's have a look and just see what happens with Air Defender 2023, the large Air Force operation, NATO's largest Air Force operation ever, which is kicking off in about 10 days' time, no less than that, in about a week's time, kicking off in Germany, the Czech Republic, Poland and Romania, with 220 plus fighters and tankers flying and practicing exercises, practicing to defend a NATO nation. So let's just see what happens there. But look, this talk on trying to just not dispel, perhaps, but investigate some of the myths that we hear or some of the stories we hear from the West. I think it's just a good thing to challenge these and do some research on these topics and not just accept them out of hand. Anyhow, there's a couple of topics in here that I'll talk more about in the future, but I'll leave this for now. Thank you.